Welcome to the Federalist Paper 41 class by the Grumpy Old Vet. This is Lesson 16 in this series. This lesson will cover Essay 41 of 85 essays, all written to the people of the state of New York, in counter to the arguments of the Anti-Federalists, to convince the people of the 13 states to ratify the Constitution. This essay was written by Madison to explain the powers delegated to the federal government by the states, why it was important and necessary to do so, and the safeguards put in place to protect the powers retained by the state from being overpowered by the federal government. With that, let's move out. Welcome to the class, Federalist Paper 41, brought to you by the Hillsdale Justice Project at Liberty Hall, narrated by John Rutan. General view of the powers conferred by the Constitution. The Federalist number 41, 19th January 1788, written by Madison for the Independent Journal. And as all 85 Federalist Papers start out, to the people of the state of New York, the Constitution proposed by the Convention may be considered under two general points of view. The first relates to the sum or quantity of power which it vests in the government, including the restraints imposed on the states. The second, to the particular structure of the government and the distribution of this power among its several branches. The Constitution created by the Convention can be looked at in two main ways. First, it determines how much power the federal government has, including the limits placed on the states. Second, it outlines how the government is structured and how that power is divided among its different branches. Under the first view of the subject, two important questions arise. 1. Whether any part of the powers transferred to the general government be unnecessary or improper. 2. Whether the entire mass of them be dangerous to the portion of jurisdiction left in the several states. From this perspective, two important questions come up. 1. Are any of the powers given to the federal government unnecessary or inappropriate? 2. Do all these powers together pose a threat to the authority that remains with the individual states? Is the aggregate power of the general government greater than ought to have been vested in it? This is the first question. The first question is, does the federal government have more power than it should? It cannot have escaped those who have attended with candor to the arguments employed against the extensive powers of the government, that the authors of them have very little considered how far these powers were necessary means of attaining a necessary end. They have chosen rather to dwell on the inconveniences which must be unavoidably blended with all political advantages, and on the possible abuses which must be incident to every power or trust, of which a beneficial use can be made. This method of handling the subject cannot impose on the good sense of the people of America. It may display the subtlety of the writer, it may open a boundless field for rhetoric and declamation, it may inflame the passions of the unthinking, and may confirm the prejudices of the misthinking. But cool and candid people will at once reflect that the purest of human blessings must have a portion of alloy in them, that the choice must always be made, if not of the lesser evil, at least of the greater, not the perfect, good, and that in every political institution, a power to advance the public happiness involves a discretion which may be misapplied and abused. They will see, therefore, that in all cases where power is to be conferred, the point first to be decided is whether such a power be necessary to the public good, as the next will be, in case of an affirmative decision, to guard as effectually as possible against a perversion of the power to the public detriment. People who have fairly considered the arguments against the government's broad powers should recognize that critics often overlook how necessary these powers are to achieving essential goals. Instead of focusing on why these powers are needed, opponents tend to emphasize the potential downsides that come with any political system and the possible misuse of authority. This kind of argument may showcase a writer's cleverness, stir up emotions, and reinforce existing biases. But thoughtful and rational individuals will understand that no system is perfect. Every good thing comes with some drawbacks, and in government, the goal is to choose the best option available, even if it isn't flawless. Every government power that serves the public good also carries the risk of being misused. Therefore, the first question should always be whether a particular power is truly necessary for the well-being of the people. If the answer is yes, the next step should be to establish safeguards to prevent its abuse. That we may form a correct judgment on this subject, it will be proper to review the several powers conferred on the government of the Union, and that this may be the more conveniently done, they may be reduced into different classes as they relate to the following different objects. 1. Security against foreign danger. 2. Regulation of the intercourse with foreign nations. 3. Maintenance of harmony and proper intercourse among the states. 4. Certain miscellaneous objects of general utility. 5. Restraint of the states from certain injurious acts. 6. Provisions for giving due efficacy to all these powers. To make a fair assessment of this issue, it is helpful to review the various powers given to the federal government. For clarity, these powers can be grouped into 6 categories based on their purpose. 1. Protecting the country from foreign threats. 2. Managing relations and trade with other nations. 3. Ensuring cooperation and resolving conflicts between states. 4. Overseeing various matters that benefit the nation as a whole. 5. Preventing states from taking actions that could be harmful. 6. Establishing measures to effectively enforce these powers. The powers falling within the first class are those of declaring war and granting letters of marque, of providing armies and fleets, of regulating and calling forth the militia, of levying and borrowing money. The powers in the first category include declaring war, authorizing private ships to attack enemies, letters of marque, creating and maintaining armies and navies, organizing and deploying the militia, and raising and borrowing money to fund these efforts. Security against foreign danger is one of the primitive objects of civil society. It is an avowed and essential object of the American Union. The powers requisite for attaining it must be effectually confided to the federal councils. The powers in the first category include declaring war, authorizing private ships to attack enemies, letters of marque, creating and maintaining armies and navies, organizing and deploying the militia, and raising and borrowing money to fund these efforts. Is the power of declaring war necessary? No man will answer this question in the negative. It would be superfluous, therefore, to enter into a proof of the affirmative. The existing Confederation establishes this power in the most ample form. Is the power to declare war necessary? No one would say no to this. Therefore, it's unnecessary to provide further proof that it is important. The current Confederation already gives this power in a thorough way. Is the power of raising armies and equipping fleets necessary? This is involved in the foregoing power. It is involved in the power of self-defense. Is the power to raise armies and equip fleets necessary? This is already included in the power to declare war. It is part of the power of self-defense. But was it necessary to give an indefinite power of raising troops, as well as providing fleets, and of maintaining both in peace as well as in war? But was it necessary to give an unlimited power to raise troops and provide fleets, and to maintain them during both peacetime and wartime? The answer to these questions has been too far anticipated in another place to admit an extensive discussion of them in this place. The answer indeed seems to be so obvious and conclusive as scarcely to justify such a discussion in any place. With what color of propriety could the force necessary for defense be limited by those who cannot limit the force of offense? If a federal constitution could chain the ambition or set bounds to the exertions of all other nations, then indeed might it prudently chain the discretion of its own government and set bounds to the exertions for its own safety. The answer to these questions has already been addressed elsewhere, so there's no need to discuss them in detail here. The answer seems so clear and obvious that it's hard to justify further debate. How could those who can't control the military strength of other nations reasonably limit their own defense capabilities? If a federal constitution could control the ambitions of other countries, then it might make sense to limit the actions of its own government for the sake of safety. How could a readiness for war in time of peace be safely prohibited, unless we could prohibit, in like manner, the preparations and establishments of every hostile nation? The means of security can only be regulated by the means and the danger of attack. They will, in fact, be ever determined by these rules, and by no others. It is in vain to oppose constitutional barriers to the impulse of self-preservation. It is worse than in vain, because it plants in the Constitution itself necessary usurpations of power, every precedent of which is a germ of unnecessary and multiplied repetitions. If one nation maintains constantly a disciplined army, ready for the service of ambition or revenge, it obliges the most pacific nations who may be within the reach of its enterprises to take corresponding precautions. The 15th century was the unhappy epoch of military establishments in the time of peace. They were introduced by Charles VII of France. All Europe has followed, or been forced into, the example. Had the example not been followed by other nations, all Europe must long ago have worn the chains of a universal monarch. Were every nation except France now to disband its peace establishments, the same event might follow. The veteran legions of Rome were an overmatch for the undisciplined valor of all other nations, and rendered her the mistress of the world. How could we safely prohibit preparing for war during peacetime unless we could also prevent every other hostile nation from doing the same? The measures for security can only be adjusted based on the potential threat and the means of attack. These factors will always determine the level of preparedness, and no others. It's pointless to set constitutional limits on self-preservation. In fact, it's harmful because it creates power grabs that become more common and more dangerous over time. If one nation always has a well-trained military ready for war, it forces even peaceful nations near it to prepare similarly. The 15th century saw the rise of military readiness during peacetime, started by Charles VII of France. Since then, all of Europe has either followed or been forced into this practice. If other nations hadn't followed suit, Europe would have been ruled by a single monarch long ago. If every country except France were to disband their military forces, the same thing could happen again. The disciplined legions of Rome defeated the less organized forces of other nations, making Rome the dominant power in the world. Not the less true is it that the liberties of Rome proved the final victim to her military triumphs, and that the liberties of Europe, as far as they ever existed, have, with few exceptions, been the price of her military establishments. A standing force, therefore, is a dangerous, at the same time that it may be a necessary provision. On the smallest scale, it has its inconveniences. On an extensive scale, its consequences may be fatal. On any scale, it is an object of laudable circumspection and precaution. A wise nation will combine all these considerations, and whilst it does not rashly preclude itself from any resource which may become essential to its safety, will exert all its prudence in diminishing both the necessity and the danger of resorting to one which may be inauspicious to its liberties. It's true that Rome's military victories eventually led to the loss of its freedoms, and similarly, the freedoms of Europe, where they existed, have often come at the cost of military forces. A standing army, therefore, is both dangerous and, at times, necessary. Even on a small scale, it brings inconveniences. On a larger scale, it could have disastrous effects. Regardless of size, it requires careful consideration and caution. A wise nation will take all these factors into account. While it shouldn't rule out any resource that could be crucial to its safety, it should use all its wisdom to reduce both the need for and the risks of relying on military power, which could harm its freedoms. The clearest marks of this prudence are stamped on the proposed Constitution. The Union itself, which it cements and secures, destroys every pretext for a military establishment which could be dangerous. America united, with a handful of troops, or without a single soldier, exhibits a more forbidding posture to foreign ambition than America disunited, with 100,000 veterans ready for combat. It was remarked, on a former occasion, that the want of this pretext had saved the liberties of one nation in Europe. Being rendered by her insular situation and her maritime resources impregnable to the armies of her neighbors, the rulers of Great Britain have never been able, by real or artificial dangers, to cheat the public into an extensive peace establishment. The distance of the United States from the powerful nations of the world gives them the same happy security. A dangerous establishment can never be necessary or plausible, so long as they continue a united people. But let it never for a moment be forgotten that they are indebted for this advantage to the Union alone. The moment of its dissolution will be the date of a new order of things. The fears of the weaker or the ambition of the stronger states or confederacies will set the same example in the new as Charles VII did in the Old World. The example will be followed here from the same motives which produced universal imitation there. Instead of deriving from our situation the precious advantage which Great Britain has derived from hers, the face of America will be but a copy of that of the continent of Europe. It will present liberty everywhere crushed between standing armies and perpetual taxes. The fortunes of disunited America will be even more disastrous than those of Europe. The sources of evil in the latter are confined to her own limits. No superior powers of another quarter of the globe intrigue among her rival nations, inflame their mutual animosities, and render them the instruments of foreign ambition, jealousy, and revenge. In America, the miseries springing from her internal jealousies, contentions, and wars would form a part only of her lot. A plentiful addition of evils would have their source in that relation in which Europe stands to this quarter of the earth, and which no other quarter of the earth bears to Europe. The proposed Constitution shows clear signs of wisdom. It creates a stronger union, which eliminates the need for a dangerous military buildup. United America, whether with a few troops or none at all, presents a greater deterrent to foreign threats than if it were divided, even with an army of 100,000 soldiers. A previous example showed how the lack of a military excuse helped protect the freedoms of one European nation. Because of its location and naval power, Britain was safe from its neighbors' armies and didn't need a large peacetime military. The United States, being far from powerful nations, enjoys similar security. As long as America stays united, a large military force isn't necessary or plausible. However, if the Union were to dissolve, things would change. The fears of weaker states or ambitions of stronger ones could lead to military buildup, just as happened in Europe. Instead of benefiting from the security of unity, America could end up like Europe, where liberty is crushed by standing armies and constant taxes. The challenges of a divided America could be worse than Europe's, with conflicts and wars among states, and the added risk of foreign powers influencing America's internal struggles. This picture of the consequences of disunion cannot be too highly colored or too often exhibited. Every man who loves peace, every man who loves his country, every man who loves liberty, ought to have it ever before his eyes, that he may cherish in his heart a due attachment to the Union of America, and be able to set a due value on the means of preserving it. The potential consequences of disunion cannot be overstated or repeated too often. Every person who values peace, loves their country, and cherishes liberty should keep this in mind. They should cultivate a strong attachment to the Union and understand the importance of preserving it. Next to the effectual establishment of the Union, the best possible precaution against danger from standing armies is a limitation of the term for which revenue may be appropriated to their support. This precaution the Constitution has prudently added. I will not repeat here the observations which I flatter myself have placed this subject in a just and satisfactory light. But it may not be improper to take notice of an argument against this part of the Constitution, which has been drawn from the policy and practice of Great Britain. It is said that the continuance of an army in that kingdom requires an annual vote of the legislature, whereas the American Constitution has lengthened this critical period to 2 years. This is the form in which the comparison is usually stated to the public. But is it a just form? Is it a fair comparison? Does the British Constitution restrain the parliamentary discretion to 1 year? Does the American impose on the Congress appropriations for 2 years? On the contrary, it cannot be unknown to the authors of the fallacy themselves that the British Constitution fixes no limit whatever to the discretion of the legislature, and that the American ties down the legislature to 2 years as the longest admissible term. To prevent danger from standing armies, one of the best precautions is to limit the time for which revenue can be allocated to support them. The Constitution wisely includes this precaution. I won't repeat everything I've said to explain this clearly, but it's worth addressing an argument against this part of the Constitution that's based on the practice of Great Britain. Some say that in Britain, the government needs an annual vote to continue funding the Army, while the American Constitution allows this for 2 years. This is the comparison often presented to the public, but is it a fair one? Does the British system limit the legislature's power to just 1 year? Does the American system automatically allow 2 years of funding? In fact, the British system places no limit on the legislature's discretion, whereas the American system limits it to 2 years as the longest possible term. Had the argument from the British example been truly stated, it would have stood thus. The term for which supplies may be appropriated to the Army establishment, though unlimited by the British Constitution, has nevertheless, in practice, been limited by parliamentary discretion to a single year. If the comparison to the British example had been stated correctly, it would have gone like this. Although the British Constitution doesn't set a limit on the length of time supplies can be allocated to the Army, in practice, Parliament has chosen to limit it to just 1 year. Now, if in Great Britain, where the House of Commons is elected for 7 years, where so great a proportion of the members are elected by so small a proportion of the people, where the electors are so corrupted by the representatives, and the representatives so corrupted by the Crown, the representative body can possess a power to make appropriations to the Army for an indefinite term, without desiring or without daring to extend the term beyond a single year, ought not suspicion herself to blush, in pretending that the representatives of the United States, elected freely by the whole body of the people every second year, cannot be safely entrusted with the discretion over such appropriations expressly limited to the short period of 2 years. In Great Britain, where members of the House of Commons serve for 7 years, many are elected by only a small group of people, and where there's corruption between voters, representatives, and the Crown, the government can approve military funding for an unlimited period, yet they still limit it to just 1 year. Shouldn't we be skeptical when people suggest that the representatives of the United States, who are elected freely by all the people every 2 years, cannot be trusted to make decisions about military funding, especially when the decision is limited to just 2 years? A bad cause seldom fails to betray itself. Of this truth, the management of the opposition to the federal government is an unvaried exemplification. But among all the blunders which have been committed, none is more striking than the attempt to enlist on that side the prudent jealousy entertained by the people of standing armies. The attempt has awakened fully the public attention to that important subject, and has led to investigations which must terminate in a thorough and universal conviction, not only that the Constitution has provided the most effectual guards against danger from that quarter, but that nothing short of a Constitution fully adequate to the national defense and the preservation of the Union can save America from as many standing armies as it may be split into states or confederacies, and from such a progressive augmentation of these establishments in each as will render them as burdensome to the properties and ominous to the liberties of the people as any establishment that can become necessary under a united and efficient government must be tolerable to the former and safe to the latter. A bad argument often reveals itself, and the opposition to the federal government is a clear example of this. Among all their mistakes, the most noticeable is their attempt to use the public's concern about standing armies against the federal government. This has only drawn more attention to the issue and led to investigations that will prove 2 things. First, that the Constitution has strong protections against the dangers of standing armies, and second, that only a fully effective Constitution for national defense and the preservation of the Union can prevent America from facing multiple standing armies, one for each state or confederacy. Such an outcome would be as burdensome and threatening to the people's property and freedoms as the worst case under a divided and weak government. The palpable necessity of the power to provide and maintain a navy has protected that part of the Constitution against a spirit of censure, which has spared few other parts. It must indeed be numbered among the greatest blessings of America that as her union will be the only source of her maritime strength, so this will be a principal source of her security against danger from abroad. In this respect, our situation bears another likeness to the insular advantage of Great Britain. The batteries most capable of repelling foreign enterprises on our safety are happily such as can never be turned by a perfidious government against our liberties. The clear need for the power to maintain a navy has shielded that part of the Constitution from criticism, unlike many other parts. It's one of America's greatest blessings that as the Union is the only source of her maritime strength, this strength also becomes a key part of her security from foreign threats. In this way, our situation is similar to Great Britain's advantage as an island nation. The strongest defenses we have against foreign threats are also the ones that can never be used against our freedoms by a dishonest government. The inhabitants of the Atlantic frontier are all of them deeply interested in this provision for naval protection, and if they have hitherto been suffered to sleep quietly in their beds, if their property has remained safe against the predatory spirit of licentious adventurers, if their maritime towns have not yet been compelled to ransom themselves from the terrors of a conflagration by yielding to the exactions of daring and sudden invaders, these instances of good fortune are not to be ascribed to the capacity of the existing government for the protection of those from whom it claims allegiance, but to causes that are fugitive and fallacious. If we except perhaps Virginia and Maryland, which are peculiarly vulnerable on their eastern frontiers, no part of the Union ought to feel more anxiety on this subject than New York. Her seacoast is extensive. The people living along the Atlantic coast are all strongly invested in this naval protection. If they have been able to sleep peacefully at night, if their property has remained safe from the threat of lawless adventurers, and if their coastal towns haven't had to pay a ransom to avoid destruction by sudden invaders, this good fortune shouldn't be credited to the current government's ability to protect them. Instead, it's due to temporary and unreliable factors. Except for possibly Virginia and Maryland, which are especially vulnerable on their eastern borders, no part of the Union should be more concerned about this issue than New York, with its long coastline. A very important district of the state is an island. The state itself is penetrated by a large navigable river for more than 50 leagues. The great emporium of its commerce, the great reservoir of its wealth, lies every moment at the mercy of events, and may almost be regarded as a hostage for ignominious compliances with the dictates of a foreign enemy, or even with the rapacious demands of pirates and barbarians. Should a war be the result of the precarious situation of European affairs, and all the unruly passions attending it be let loose on the ocean, our escape from insults and depredations, not only on that element, but every part of the other bordering on it, will be truly miraculous. In the present condition of America, the states more immediately exposed to these calamities have nothing to hope from the phantom of a general government which now exists. And if their single resources were equal to the task of fortifying themselves against the danger, the object to be protected would be almost consumed by the means of protecting them. A key part of the state is an island, and a large navigable river cuts through the state for over 50 miles. The main hub of its trade and wealth is constantly at risk, vulnerable to being controlled by a foreign enemy or even to the greedy demands of pirates and other threats. If a war were to break out due to unstable European situations, and if all the chaos of war spilled over into the ocean, it would be nothing short of a miracle if we managed to avoid attacks and losses, not just at sea, but along the coastlines as well. Given the current state of America, the regions most at risk have no real support from the weak federal government that exists now. Even if these regions had the resources to protect themselves, those resources would be stretched so thin they could barely defend their land. The power of regulating and calling forth the militia has been already sufficiently vindicated and explained. The power to regulate and call up the militia has already been clearly justified and explained. The power of levying and borrowing money being the sinew of that which is to be exerted in the national defense, is properly thrown into the same class with it. This power also has been examined already with much attention, and has, I trust, been clearly shown to be necessary, both in the extent and form given to it by the Constitution. I will address one additional reflection only to those who contend that the power ought to have been restrained to external taxation, by which they mean taxes on articles imported from other countries. It cannot be doubted that this will always be a valuable source of revenue, that for a considerable time it must be a principal source, that at this moment it is an essential one. But we may form very mistaken ideas on this subject if we do not call to mind in our calculations that the extent of revenue drawn from foreign commerce must vary with the variations, both in the extent and the kind of imports, and that these variations do not correspond with the progress of population, which must be the general measure of the public wants. As long as agriculture continues the sole field of labor, the importation of manufactures must increase as the consumers multiply. As soon as domestic manufactures are begun by the hands not called for by agriculture, the imported manufactures will decrease as the numbers of people increase. In a more remote stage, the imports may consist in a considerable part of raw materials, which will be wrought into articles for exportation, and will, therefore, require rather the encouragement of bounties than to be loaded with discouraging duties. A system of government meant for duration ought to contemplate these revolutions and be able to accommodate itself to them. The power to raise and borrow money, which is essential for national defense, is rightly grouped with the other powers for defense. This power has already been thoroughly examined and, I hope, shown to be necessary in both its scope and how the Constitution grants it. I'll make just one more point, for those who believe the power should have been limited to taxes on imports. There's no doubt that taxes on imports will always be an important source of revenue, and for a long time, it will remain a major one, especially right now. However, we could be mistaken if we only consider this revenue source without realizing that the amount of money we can raise from foreign trade will change with what and how much we import. These changes won't always align with the population's growth, which is the key measure of public needs. When agriculture is the primary form of work, the need for imported goods will grow as the population grows. But when domestic manufacturing begins to develop, the need for imported goods will decrease as the population grows. In later stages, imports may mostly consist of raw materials, which will be used to make products for export. These should be encouraged with subsidies, not taxed heavily. A system of government designed to last should take these changes into account and be flexible enough to adapt to them. Some who have not denied the necessity of the power of taxation have grounded a very fierce attack against the Constitution on the language in which it is defined. It has been urged and echoed that the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts, and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States amounts to an unlimited commission to exercise every power which may be alleged to be necessary for the common defense or general welfare. No stronger proof could be given of the distress under which these writers labor for objections than their stooping to such a misconstruction. Some people who haven't denied the need for the power to tax have launched a strong attack on the Constitution because of the way it is worded. They argue that the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts, and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States gives the government unlimited authority to do anything they claim is necessary for the defense or welfare of the country. The fact that these critics have resorted to such a misinterpretation shows how desperate they are to find objections. Had no other enumeration or definition of the powers of the Congress been found in the Constitution than the general expressions just cited, the authors of the objection might have had some color for it, though it would have been difficult to find a reason for so awkward a form of describing an authority to legislate in all possible cases. A power to destroy the freedom of the press, the trial by jury, or even to regulate the course of dissents, or the forms of conveyances must be very singularly expressed by the terms to raise money for the general welfare. If the Constitution only listed the powers of Congress using the broad language we've seen, the critics might have had some reason to argue this way. However, it would still be hard to explain why such a vague phrase would be used to describe the authority to legislate on every possible issue. For example, a power to take away freedom of the press, trial by jury, or even to control inheritance laws or how property is transferred would certainly need to be stated more clearly than just saying to raise money for the general welfare. But what color can the objection have when a specification of the objects alluded to by these general terms immediately follows and is not even separated by a longer pause than a semicolon? If the different parts of the same instrument ought to be so expounded as to give meaning to every part which will bear it, shall one part of the same sentence be excluded altogether from a share in the meaning? And shall the more doubtful and indefinite terms be retained in their full extent, and the clear and precise expressions be denied any signification whatsoever? For what purpose could the enumeration of particular powers be inserted, if these and all others were meant to be included in the preceding general power? Nothing is more natural nor common than first to use a general phrase, and then to explain and qualify it by a recital of particulars. But the idea of an enumeration of particulars, which neither explain nor qualify the general meaning, and can have no other effect than to confound and mislead, is an absurdity, which, as we are reduced to the dilemma of charging either on the authors of the objection or on the authors of the Constitution, we must take the liberty of supposing had not its origin with the latter. How can there be any real objection when a list of specific powers related to the general terms comes right after, and it's not even separated by more than a semicolon? If the different parts of the same document should be interpreted to give meaning to each part, how can one part of the sentence be ignored, while the more vague and general terms are taken at face value, and the clear specific ones are given no meaning at all? Why would the list of particular powers be included if they were just meant to be covered by the broad general power beforehand? It's common to start with a general phrase and then clarify it with specific details. But the idea of listing details that don't clarify or limit the general meaning and only serve to confuse doesn't make sense. So, when faced with this contradiction, we can reasonably assume that the authors of the Constitution didn't intend for this misunderstanding to happen. The objection here is the more extraordinary, as it appears that the language used by the Convention is a copy from the Articles of Confederation. The objects of the Union among the states, as described in Article 3rd, are their common defense, security of their liberties, and mutual and general welfare. The terms of Article 8th are still more identical. All charges of war and all other expenses that shall be incurred for the common defense or general welfare and allowed by the United States and Congress shall be defrayed out of a common treasury, etc. A similar language again occurs in Article 9. Construe either of these articles by the rules which would justify the construction put on the new Constitution, and they vest in the existing Congress a power to legislate in all cases whatsoever. But what would have been thought of that assembly if, attaching themselves to these general expressions, and disregarding the specifications which ascertain and limit their import, they had exercised an unlimited power of providing for the common defense and general welfare? I appeal to the objectors themselves, whether they would, in that case, have employed the same reasoning in justification of Congress as they now make use of against the Convention. How difficult it is for error to escape its own condemnation. Publius. The objection is especially strange because the language used in the Constitution seems to be directly taken from the Articles of Confederation. In Article 3 of the Articles of Confederation, the goals of the Union among the states are described as their common defense, security of their liberties, and mutual and general welfare. The wording in Article 8 is even closer. All charges of war and other expenses for the common defense or general welfare and approved by the United States in Congress shall be paid from a common treasury. A similar phrase appears in Article 9 as well. If you interpret any of these articles using the same reasoning applied to the new Constitution, it would give Congress unlimited power to legislate on anything. But imagine what would have happened if Congress, ignoring the specific limits on their powers, had taken this broad language to justify unlimited control over the common defense and general welfare. I ask the objectors themselves, if this had happened, would they have used the same arguments to defend Congress as they are using now against the new Constitution? It's hard for errors to avoid contradicting themselves. Publius. Summary. 1. Necessity of a strong federal government. Madison argues that the federal government needs certain powers to ensure the safety, stability, and prosperity of the nation, particularly in defense, foreign relations, and maintaining peace among the states. A weak federal government would be ineffective and unable to handle these critical responsibilities. 2. Defense and national security. One of the most important powers granted to the federal government is the ability to raise and maintain an army, maintain a navy, and engage in foreign diplomacy. This is essential for protecting the country against foreign threats and ensuring internal peace. 3. Avoiding military tyranny. Madison acknowledges the danger of a standing army, as seen in historical examples, but argues that the federal government's ability to raise and control the military should be balanced with oversight and limitations to avoid misuse or tyranny. The size of the army must mirror the size of the foreign threat to prevent the military from growing too large and becoming a potential tool for tyranny. 4. Role of the states and the federal government. While the federal government will have the power to defend the nation and deal with external threats, the states will retain significant authority over internal matters. Madison emphasizes the need for a balance between federal and state power, with each serving different purposes. 5. The issue of taxes and war. The paper discusses the federal government's power to collect taxes, particularly for the purposes of funding defense efforts. Madison argues that it is crucial for the government to be able to raise funds, but warns that excessive taxation or military control should be carefully managed. He also states that taxes for war could only last until the next legislative election, giving the people more power over where, when, and how long wars lasted. In short, Federalist Paper 41 highlights the need for a balanced and effective federal government that can protect the nation, manage military forces, and raise revenue while still preserving the powers and rights of the states. This concludes the 16th class in this series on Federalist Paper 41. I hope you found this information helpful and entertaining. I will see you in Class 17, where we will cover Federalist Paper 45. Fall out.